The second Craig Jones Invitational is in the books, and we need to talk about it. Was it a success? Was it a failure? Well, there were some positives. There were definitely some negatives. There's a little bit in between. There are some lessons to be learned, so let's talk about them. First, let me just start with my own inherent biases. Some people wish to deny them. I'm going to tell you what they are so that you can then make a determination about the conclusions that I draw. Am I being fair? Am I not? You can decide. Me personally, I like Craig Jones a lot. Now, I don't know him too well on a personal level. We've interacted a few times. He was in my office for an interview once, but I don't know him super well. I don't mean so much on that level, although, again, he's been very kind to deal with. What I mean is I think he's very good for jiu-jitsu. Here is somebody who, by the way, in this tournament poured in an absurd amount of money, especially with the way things went yesterday, where now New Wave also gets $1 million. So that's $1 million to B Team, $1 million to New Wave, $100,000 to Helena Cravar, plus $100,000 to Victor Hugo, another $50,000 to Felipe Pena, and anyone else who scored a submission, and of course the sort of smaller but still real fee that they were able to pay for anyone else who competed. This is the most that any jiu-jitsu tournament has ever paid out for its winners, or frankly even its participants, certainly specifically in cases and then more aggregately. This is the most generous jiu-jitsu payout in the sport's history, and CJI 1, I think, was already the leader in that clubhouse, and this one smoked that. That is pretty remarkable to see that kind of a number. But more than that, it's just the vision and the amount of promotional work that he has done. This guy, Craig Jones, was out there doing as many interviews as he could in as many different places as he could, was promoting this event relentlessly, which actually was kind of one of the problems, but not because of what Craig was doing, but only because Craig was doing it. Nevertheless, I think a guy like this in jiu-jitsu who believes in the independence of the athletes, who believes that the athletes should come first, and that the sport can and should be presented in a more fan-friendly and exciting way, did everything work out for CJI 2? I don't think a fair look at it would bring you to that conclusion. Nevertheless, the attempt at it, the vision for it, and the gall to try, to me, is exceedingly important, because even the very best people are not going to be able to get things right, either with bad luck or bad planning, or a combination of both. But what you want is the attempt. What you want is the vision. What you want is someone in a position of leadership and potentially financial compensation to be able to want to deliver on these ends. And you don't want the same, people bring this up all the time. Isn't this something UFC, BJJ could potentially do better? Yeah, on some level, I suppose there are ways in which they could, but having one combat sports promoter for boxing, which is a possibility, having one major promoter, one only real sort of serious lasting promotion is already what you have in MMA. Trying to then have that again in sport jiu-jitsu, to me, seems like not really a smart way to go about it. You want people with different ideas and the willingness to then act on them. Some of them will work, some of them won't, but he has proven in the past the ability to make something like this work, and more broadly, I think has a commitment and a vision for the sport that so very few have, so very few understand. He is an enormous asset to jiu-jitsu. And to that point, the Super Bowl nature of CJI, I think, is exactly, I don't know what the sport needs, but I certainly think it's a big asset to the sport. In a world where it's not just in jiu-jitsu or even really in combat sports, it's everywhere. This desire to have everything scalable to as many different ways as you can in order to sell the most with this glut of content. Everybody is doing that now. Everyone wants to know, how can we take something that could be good or kind of good and just stretch it out as much as possible to give as much of it as possible to the consumers, whether or not it has value or not. A Super Bowl idea, again, trying to rally around this singular idea of a huge event and making it as big and as special and as, potentially unusual as you possibly can. This is a good way, I think, to at least think about jiu-jitsu promotion, or at least at a bare minimum, a good kind of thing to add to the broader array of choices that already exist in sport jiu-jitsu. A single, again, it's a 2-day event, but a single event to think about in this way is by itself as a concept, and then Craig Jones pushing it, I think, is highly commendable. More to that point, I want to say one more thing about it, if I may. I cannot overstate the degree to which Craig Jones promoted this event. It really has not gone noticed. It really has not been nearly, I think, as welcomed or celebrated as it should have been. Again, I think part of the problem was that the way in which this event was constructed naturally created a system where he was the only one promoting it, and I do think that's a fair criticism and a problem, but just the labor that he put in to promote something like this is unusual. I don't know if I've ever seen anything quite like it, in part because, as I mentioned, you're dealing with a Super Bowl type model once a year. So he had most of the year to just focus and train the guns on exactly this date, and he did that. A Herculean effort to promote this event, and it really, really, really needs to be acknowledged, the lengths that he went to personally to uplift this event. And you can also say, day one, not great, but day two was really fun. If day one had been like day two, I think there'd actually be a lot less complaining. Unfortunately, it was not, but day two was certainly a lot of fun. You had more submissions, you had better action. Yeah, granted, some of those came from mismatches in weight, but nevertheless, people were pushing it a little bit harder and you got a little bit more. That wasn't true across the board by any stretch of the imagination, but even in some of the double elimination matches, where no submission was reached, you still had guys really getting after it, and I think that was kind of important. Declan Moody taking on Ethan Krellinston, he barely survived, but there was, constant action being pushed. In Nicky Rod's last match where he got a 10-8 ultimately in the way that it was decided, that was pretty exciting as well. So a much better day two than day one, but of course the problem was that there was a day one. And attendance, I don't have what the formal figure was. Viewership, I don't have what the formal figure was. I saw that both of them have at least done 2.5 million views or more, so it's still a considerable win. Whether it's on par with CJI 1, I do not know, but it did not look to me like a failure necessarily at the box office, not a gigantic win for sure. And then again, on the streaming side, it still looked to me to be pretty good. Whether or not it was exactly what they got from CJI 1, I think still remains to be seen, but certainly they didn't up the ante from CJI 1. It wasn't bigger than CJI 1, and that needs to be acknowledged as well. Now let's talk about some of the challenges that came out of this. The first one is, I just don't think the Quintet system worked here. There can be tournaments you can point to where the Quintet system really delivered for folks, or there could be individual, team versus team matchups in a larger tournament system that they would like and could point to as evidence that this system works. Again, one event does not prove or disprove the value of a system. What you can say in this particular case, though, was, obviously between day one and day two, Craig was like, $50K per submission. To what extent that facilitated some of the action that we saw on day two and made it a better day is up for debate. But day one was long and a little bit dreadful. It was so many different double eliminations, and a lot of matches where, we'll talk more about this, guys couldn't pass, or it was just an endless leg entanglement battle. It really was not very good, and the team versus team aspect of it made it feel like it was slow and it took forever, and there wasn't a lot of rivalry between the teams. There were some interesting matchups, along the way, but I don't know. It didn't. I think they were looking for some kind of twist or elevation from CJI 1, and you simply did not get that. It felt like a lot of bureaucracy, honestly. It didn't necessarily add a ton to the whole experience. Again, there were certainly individual bouts or sometimes team dynamics that were kind of interesting. There were some overperformers. Team Australasia, definitely a great example of that. But I don't know. To me, it seemed like the Quintet system fell a little flat here. Too many double eliminations, too much stalling action, too much, just not enough happening to justify the construction of the project in this particular way. I'd also say some of the way in which the product was constructed, even with that, didn't work for me. So for example, one of the things that I thought was very curious when Craig told me about it here was that, hey, we're going to have the sort of like a Royal Rumble style where, if one person eliminates the other and then the team has a chance to bring up who they want next, they're going to be able to choose on the fly, and then you're not going to know who it is. But then that didn't really work out that way. The coach was asked by Michael C. Williams, the announcer, and then he would announce it, then they'd bring him out. Like there was no suspense that was really, or very little anyway. And I understand why they might do that, because that little bit of time gives the production team a chance to get maybe a side-by-side, a tail of the tape thing ready. It gives the production team a chance to react better in real time, but it made the nature of how that worked feel transactional and not suspenseful. That didn't do necessarily a lot for me. And honestly, listen, I realize at this point that no-gi jiu-jitsu is like the form of jiu-jitsu that we want to sell to the public, and there are many, many good reasons for that. I certainly understand it, but I gotta tell you, if the argument was that gi jiu-jitsu is less accessible to the public, I think on balance that is certainly true. But I don't know how true it was relative to what we got this time. Just about every sub that you can do in no-gi, you can do in gi. I mean, more or less, right? If you can do a rear naked choke in no-gi, you can do it in gi. If you can do an arm bar in no-gi, you can do it in gi. I mean, there might be some that don't translate because of the cloth or whatever, but in general, if you can do it in no-gi, you can do it in gi. But the reverse is obviously not true. You cannot really do, I mean, I know there are some like janky varieties, but you can't really do a bow and arrow choke in gi, in no-gi. You can't really do a clock choke. You can't really do something, double lapel, or a lasso, or a loop choke, or whatever. Like, you just can't do certain things in no-gi in the same way that you can do them in the gi. Like, the amount of submissions that you have offered to you in the gi are significantly more. More to that point, it gets me to this point. Like, dude, people could not really pass the guard. People were able to lasso, repummel in, and then just kind of keep the whole process going again. And then you get some of these matchups where it'd be leg entangler versus leg entangler. That to me was like no different than, 2012 or 2013, whatever the year was, where like the Meows are coming through and they're playing this leg entanglement battle with the gi, where it's like, what does this really do for the action? What does this do for the general public? What does this do? Like, why is this a superior alternative? And again, I understand that certain tournaments are just not going to work out every way that you want, but like, if the whole idea is that gi jiu-jitsu is better than no-gi for the if no-gi jiu-jitsu is better than gi for the public, it didn't really feel like that to me. It felt like there was a lot of stalling, which again, the second day they were a lot better about calling, and that was good. Again, you got more submissions the second day. That was also good. Again, second day was just so much better than day one. But the takeaway from CJI 2 is not that no-gi is in every way better than gi for the public. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that the gi is the most accessible thing. I understand that the arguments about the gi are in general quite true, but no-gi had a problem here. People couldn't pass. They would set up grips and like early attempts at passing, and they couldn't really get anywhere. And it was a problem with that. Like, it was hard for guys to get the back. It was hard for them to do really much of anything. You would have to wait for them to be like big weight disparities or talent disparities for there to be any meaningful amount. And of course, that goes back to like the 8-minute rounds. And it's like, how much dude, you get 2 elite black belts, 8 minutes is not much. Meta Morris would do 20, and sometimes that wasn't enough. US Grappling has no time limit because that's just the way that it has to be, again, for some of that rule set, but like that works pretty well with that rule set. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is there was a bit of a problem with the no-gi jiu-jitsu in this match, or this event. Just too much of the action looking the same, too much stalling out, and guys having a real hard time beyond just the initial grip fighting battle of consistently being able to pass. And listen, Craig is trying something ambitious. This is a very difficult thing to get right, especially like if you're just going to have a Super Bowl style event. You got basically one weekend to get it right, and that's it. Either it goes right or it doesn't. It's very, very difficult to please people under a system like that, no question about it. But what I would say is, they didn't iron out the rules, I think, as well as they could have. And this is something that, I think by next time they can get a lot of this fixed. There were several tapping controversies. There was one in the Wagner-Hocha fight, but the big one was the Giancarlo Bodoni in the opening sort of duel, where did he tap, did he not? By most jiu-jitsu rule standards, he definitely did not. But the problem is that doesn't mean anything, because CJI often uses hybrid rules or different interpretations. And Big John McCarthy puts out a video explaining why, under like a more MMA style of consideration, that the tap was real, or they at least had a sufficient basis by which to go by. And I'm sympathetic to that logic, but I can understand why people who don't watch MMA or are more accustomed to jiu-jitsu rule sets would have a problem with that. It wasn't really ironed out. What are the rules going forward? What should the rules going forward be for tapping in CJI? Is it 2 taps? Is it 3? Is it the referee intervening? Is there a verbal submission guideline as well? If they scream, if you hear or see an injury, like what exactly are the rules around tapping? That needs to be ironed out. That was kind of a big problem on day one. And then more to the point, is that the way it ended up being settled, the rules were kind of confusing. You basically had 5 double eliminations because nobody was able to get the submission in the final B Team versus New Wave showdown, except that B Team lost 2 of those and New Wave won. So by that rule, they basically should have gotten the nod. But the problem was because there was a misunderstanding, or because the rules were not clearly articulated, they then went and said, well, yeah, they won 3 but won 2, but now we have to go to the judges' scorecards. And because there was a 10-8 in the final round with how Nicky Rod had performed, they just went ahead and said, okay, well, now it's 47-47. And then by that rule, B Team wins because the last match was the Nicky Rod match. And I can understand why they came to that conclusion in real time, but it goes back to having the rules not as cleanly articulated as they need to be, which then, yes, it resulted in New Wave getting another $1 million, and that's great for the sport of jiu-jitsu and those athletes. And by the way, New Wave was the best team in this whole tournament. B Team performed very ably, but pound for pound, it felt to me like New Wave definitely had the strongest team. In any case, should New Wave be declared the real winners? I'll leave that to Craig and the tournament organizers. But I think some of that stuff for CJI 3, if there even is one, definitely needs to be ironed out. One of the interesting parts about this one was when we watched CJI 1, it felt like this breakthrough in entertainment because you would have this wall that surrounded the mat and there would be no restarts. You wouldn't have to pause the action, pull guys to the middle, and then restart them. It just kind of keeps going. What was interesting about this tournament, and this is a small criticism, and I don't really know what the answer is, except maybe make the grappling surface smaller if that's what you want to do, but the wall did not factor in as much this time. It didn't seem as novel as it did the first time, which of course makes sense. How could it? What I mean to say is, people seem to realize that a lot of trouble starts along the wall. So they were doing everything they can to keep these contests in the middle. Now, it did happen that they got to the wall at times, and even in the corner, which was a real big problem. And interesting things would happen. There would be reversals that happened there. There would be throws that happened there. There was one case where for Victor Hugo, where his opponent got up on the wall, so their feet are on the wall, and they're kind of almost facing their chest is almost facing the mat. Victor Hugo snapped him down, and he goes flying down, to the canvas. That kind of stuff happened, and that was cool. But it's the main purpose of the wall is to facilitate a lack of restarts, or I should say, is to facilitate no restarts. The action just keeps going. That's what it's trying to do, and it certainly served that purpose. But adding some other interesting dimensions to the grappling itself, there was some of that, especially again when you had weight disparity, but it wasn't as pronounced in the first tournament. And I think that might just be the case going forward. That's not something specific, I think, to CJI 2. That seems like the competitors realizing they had to get better about this, and then having more discipline about where they were trying to see how their matches went, kind of created for this circumstance. So it wasn't as novel this time for understandable reasons, but it was something that we noticed. And obviously, it's not Craig's fault that Gable Steveson pulled out for whatever reason he pulled out for the week of the tournament. I mean, it's terrible luck, but it's not his fault. However, even he later admitted, if you're going to have a Super Bowl style model, you need to have a backup well in advance, considered, thought of, ready to go. And they probably should have done that earlier. Again, I mean, you book people for these dates and then they pull out with very, let's call it, questionable excuses. It's unfortunate, but even if there had been a legitimate reason, they still would have been in a similar position. Okay, well, what's your backup plan? And they didn't really have one. I think going forward, they're going to have to be. Before I forget, though, one of the things that also worked out really well for this tournament was I thought the women's tournament was great. Helena Cravar looked amazing. Some of the scores in their opening match, I think, are a little bit questionable, but doesn't matter. All the women I thought in this particular event performed ably. Their matches were really good. And Helena Cravar getting that submission late in the finals was tremendous. That all worked out really well to me. And again, that was more of a traditional tournament style. It's just sort of semifinals, which makes you wonder, could the quintet system worked if it was just 4 teams? Rather than the quarterfinals, which take kind of forever to get through, you just have 4 teams. Is that enough to do a jiu-jitsu match, a CJI is enough to do an event? I don't know. I mean, maybe you have to do that plus two other kinds of tournaments or a different kind of tournament. So there's like almost like two different style of tournaments happening per CJI. I don't know. I don't know how that would work, but I would just say the women's tournament worked really well this time. The winner was deserved. The matches were great. It kind of stood out. I liked the round system there a little bit relative to just the 8-minute matches that they were doing. I don't know. Like, it seemed to me like part of maybe one lesson from the success of CJI 1 plus the women's tournament at CJI 2 is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. You know what I mean? Like, that system, I'm not saying that the 5-minute rounds is the best way to do grappling. That's really not my point, but it might create for a better tournament experience for all the parties involved. I don't know that, but it's at least worth considering, kind of given what we got here. The Renato Laranja stuff, I'm not going to dwell on. I think it's a bit, and if it's a bit and everyone's in on the bit, then like you can choose to laugh at the jokes or you can choose not to. But what I would say is, I think you're going to get mixed reactions on them. Some people are going to like them. Some people are not. Some people are not going to know what to do with it, including the commentary crew. They never had any idea what to do with it. And if it's filling time because the production team needs like a time killer so that they have other stuff they can do, then I understand. But if that's not the purpose of what it's doing, then it's not fulfilling a meaningful purpose, in my judgment. Like, I think it'd be better to just move the broadcast along. You're going to be adding these other production elements. They need to be there for a reason. And again, they might be behind the scenes. But if that's not what they're doing, then I think most people would say scrap it and then just have the tournament go quicker. As for me, as I mentioned, I thought New Wave was the best team. These are my standouts from CJI 2, again, in no particular order, and you might disagree, but for me, it goes something like this. I've got Giancarlo Bodoni. I thought he was probably overall one of the better guys, if not the best guy in the whole tournament. Dorian Olivares, who I thought was an absolute demon with the way he was attacking passing. Victor Hugo, again, had a phenomenal day too. Nicky Rod was consistently good throughout this tournament. You might call him Mr. CJI. He really is quite important. Dude, Kenta Iwamoto absolutely blew me away. And I don't think he even won a single match that he had, but he had unenviable circumstances in both cases, either with a super hyped opponent or a much bigger opponent, and he still gave all of them the business. Taylor Pearman actually was the one who either, you're depending on did he tap him or not, but gave Bodoni a bit of a tough problem there. The 10th Planet, I can never remember how to pronounce his last name correctly. Kyle Beam, I forget, please forgive me. But he actually, even though 10th Planet didn't go past the opening round, he had a great tournament. And then Helena Cravar was just sensational the entire time, as I mentioned. But again, all the women really performed quite well. So there were some standout performers. New Wave was good. B-Team was great. They were great the whole way through. Again, Team Australasia I thought was super, super impressive. The women's tournament killed. Day 2, much better. The promotional effort that Craig put in, the amount of money that Craig put in, the amount of labor he put in, these are all highly commendable things, but at the end of the day, how do people feel about CJI 2? They're not getting the same vibes that they got and the same feeling that they got watching CJI 1. It did not feel as revelatory. CJI 1 it felt like you had the dawn of an era. It felt like, whoa, this is so much better. And you had these matches that seemed incomprehensibly good. Getting the Ruotolos back might be a real big difference maker going forward. Guys who are going to attack for the sub, that kind of a thing, versus just getting really good guys who, like Wagner Hoch is very, very good, but it seemed like New Wave brought him in not to stall out, but to just not get submitted, put him in the right matchups, and you eliminate the other team's one of their better guys potentially. And that's a valuable way to play a strategy game, but it doesn't do much for us at home. Anyway, things to consider. So there's actually lots of positives, but at the end of the day, CJI 1, it felt fresh, it felt new, it felt big. And CJI 2, to me, clearly was a labor of love. And I have great respect for Craig. I have great respect for all the event organizers. And I think that they are major contributors to the sport of jiu-jitsu. But I also believe there are definitely some lessons we should learn about what went right and what went wrong in this tournament. And if there is a CJI 3, and I certainly hope that there is, that maybe some of these changes could be incorporated going forward. Not a bad tournament, but just not what CJI 1 was. They can't all be, but can it be better than it was? I think it probably can.